This is the chapter that proves Russia did not only work through keyboards, it also worked through smiles, introductions, conferences, shared causes, private trust, and the slow, careful art of being welcomed into rooms where power already lived. That is chapter 10. And this chapter matters because it changes the viewer's picture of influence. A lot of people imagine foreign operations as something loud. A hack, a breach, a leak, a fake account, a propaganda blast. But some influence campaigns do not begin by breaking in. They begin by being invited in. That is the hook. Access as a weapon. And once you understand that, this chapter stops looking like a side story. It starts looking like a method. Mariia Butina is central here not because she represents a cyber strike, but because she represents a softer lane of entry. A more social lane. A more patient lane. A lane built on relationships, affinity, ideology, and introduction. That is what makes this chapter unsettling. Because it does not begin with a shattered firewall. It begins with a handshake. It begins with a smile at a conference. A dinner table. A photo. A shared cause. A conversation that looks normal in public and useful in private. This chapter is not about hacking the system. It is about entering the system through trust. And that distinction matters. Because if the public only knows how to recognize hostile influence when it looks like sabotage, then it will miss the version that arrives dressed as friendship. That is the deeper danger in this chapter. According to the Justice Department, Butina worked to develop relationships with U.S. persons and infiltrate organizations having influence in American politics, all for the purpose of advancing Russian interests. That line matters because it tells you exactly what kind of chapter this is. Not theft. Not brute force. Cultivation. Not smashing through the wall. Walking through the front door. And once that happens, the whole atmosphere changes. This is no longer a story about stolen emails or technical anomalies. It is a story about proximity. Who gets invited? Who gets introduced? Who gets trusted? Who gets treated as harmless? Who gets to stand close enough to power that influence no longer looks foreign at all? That is why the environment matters so much in this chapter. The conservative world. The gun rights world. The conference world. The donor world. The world of causes, dinners, meetings, forums, and relationship building. That is where the story lives. And this is where discipline matters. The strongest version of this chapter does not claim that every person in that world knowingly joined a Russian operation. It does not claim that every organization was secretly captured. And it does not scream that every handshake was espionage. That would weaken the chapter. The real point is colder than that. The point is that this environment became a pathway. The operation did not require everyone in the room to know what room they were in. That is how influence often works. A person can appear to be a friendly activist, a charming foreign contact, a harmless enthusiast, a cause ally, a network builder, and still function as something much more serious. That is why this chapter belongs in the series. It reveals a different Russian method. Not hacking, but cultivation. Not theft, but access. Not brute force, but social engineering aimed at elite political networks. That is the method. And the method matters because it is so easy to underestimate. People tend to take soft contact less seriously than hard intrusion. A dinner looks less alarming than a breach. A conference badge looks less alarming than malware. A conversation looks less alarming than a covert payment. But that instinct can be fatal. Because if influence can move through introductions, trust, and shared ideological space, then the battlefield is much larger than most people want to admit. It includes receptions, conferences, political networking, cause-based communities, private social channels, rooms where people stop guarding themselves because everyone seems to belong. That is what makes this chapter so dangerous. Influence hid in plain sight. And when influence hides in plain sight, exposure becomes harder. Because normal life becomes cover. That is why Butina matters. And that is why Alexander Torshin matters. Because this was not just random social climbing. It was channel building. The point was not merely to meet people. The point was to create an unofficial line. to move closer, to gather value, to make relationships useful, to convert social welcome into political leverage. Sometimes the operation is not the conversation itself. Sometimes the operation is building the network that makes later influence possible. That is the real force of this chapter. And once you see that, the public record hits differently. Butina was charged. She later pleaded guilty. She was sentenced. That matters because it gives the story legal weight. It tells the audience this was not just suspicious optics. It crossed into criminal consequence. But even here, the most important lesson is bigger than one defendant. The chapter matters because it teaches the viewer how influence can travel without looking like classic espionage. That lesson is bigger than Butina. Bigger than one case. Bigger than one cycle of headlines. Because modern influence operations do not always announce themselves with menace. Sometimes they flatter. Sometimes they network. Sometimes they align themselves with values already present in the room. Sometimes they wear the costume of belonging so well that people stop asking who benefits from the access. That is the democratic vulnerability this chapter exposes. A system can defend itself against enemies it knows how to recognize. It struggles much more against influence that arrives as welcome. That is why this chapter is so important in the structure of the series. Earlier chapters showed attack, contact, concealment, opportunism, surveillance abuse, and technical confusion. This chapter shows the soft corridor, the human corridor, the social corridor, the corridor where access itself becomes leverage. So if the world asks what Chapter 10 really proves, the answer is this: Russia did not only work through hacking and propaganda. It also worked through access, introductions, trust building, and unofficial relationship channels inside American political space. Mariia Butina became a central figure in that lane because she worked to build relationships with people positioned to influence U.S. politics. She later pleaded guilty and was sentenced. But the larger lesson is not just about her case. It is about the method. Influence stopped looking like espionage and started looking like networking. Not every operation breaks in. Sometimes it is welcomed in. And the next chapter takes us into another kind of distortion altogether. The Dossier. The file that did not just make allegations. It changed the battlefield itself. Big hugs, Big Dave. Watch the playlist in the description for the 15 deep dives Russia-Trump connections. Support Ukraine at United 24 Media to support democracy.